Okay, well, my next guest is a political analyst, and she's actually a senior associate at the Anthony's College of Oxford University. And she has a Master's of International Affairs, a degree from Columbia University. And actually, she was a blogger at the Huffington Post. And if you've been watching Alex Jones, you would know that he interviewed the CNN journalist Amber Leon, who lost her job with CNN over her reporting of the Bahrain revolution. Well, Bahrain being a country that is already controlled by the U.S. hegemony. So having a revolution there wasn't very good for the people in power. So of course the media, the mainstream media, wasn't reporting on it. So with this CNN journalist being brave enough to step up and talk about it, she lost her job. And actually the same thing happened to Sharmeen Narwani, our next guest, who has been censored by the Huffington Post. And she's here to talk to us about some of the things that she wrote that was censored by the mainstream media. Hello, Sharmeen, are you there?
Hi, how are you doing?
Hi, Sharmeen. Good, thank you. And you?
Very good. Looking forward to this.
Okay, well, first of all, you've been to Syria twice, I believe, in the last 2 years. Could you just tell us how your experience there changed your mind or set up your thoughts on Syria?
Yeah, actually, I've been to Syria 3 times this year already. And when I started writing about Syria, I think the first article I ever wrote was in December. It was a hard one because there were so many conflicting views on and reports about what was taking place there, as you well know. And that continues to this day. It's quite remarkable. And there's even evidentiary stuff that sometimes backs both sides. So it is a confusing story. And I started off by writing about the Arab League decisions regarding Syria, because that was a new development in the Middle East, the Arab League taking a very active role suddenly in deciding the fate of its neighbors, and as it had done with Libya as well right before that. And then, I thought it was a bit dodgy the way suddenly certain members of the Arab League had catapulted to prominence and were not only leading the way, but smacking other member states into obedience. And then I came across a piece by Stratford, the American, the U.S.-based risk analysis or intelligence group, and Stratford wrote something very interesting. It actually bucked the narratives on Syria and said that the opposition, the organized opposition outside of Syria, was lying and lying big, and gave 4 different pieces of evidence to back this up, and said that the opposition was digging themselves a hole by doing this, and everyone, all the legitimate opposition, would also be tainted by this if this kind of thing continued. And it was something along the lines of what I was feeling. I was feeling like there was, something missing from the Syrian story. It didn't make sense to me. So I took my first trip in January, and it was, I won't say it was a life-changing trip, because, but it did confirm some things for me. First of all, it confirmed to me that there was a significant segment of the Syrian population that was still behind their president or had not turned against him. And how did I see this? For instance, going into Syria, I saw immediately things that I hadn't seen during previous trips, well before the Arab awakenings hit the region, which was, Facebook was available. I could see the much vilified Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya on TV. I could even see the U.S.-sponsored Al Hurra on my TV screens there. I witnessed a very big pro-Assad demonstration that, for me, was notably not picked up anywhere in the West. I did see snippets of this demonstration on YouTube, but amazingly showing very, very few people in the crowds. I actually got there before, now this is the big pro-regime demonstration where Assad and his wife and I think 2 of their children showed up. I got there after the Assads spoke. I think I had a meeting or something. I got there after they, and the crowds were huge still. I videotaped it and I put it online. But these YouTube videos showed no crowds. Whereas for hours after the Assads left, there were, Syrians of all ages, with the Islamist hijab, without, of all walks of life, soldiers, civilians laughing, dancing, doing traditional Arabic dances, the dabke, and waving flags. And so I thought, well, here's something you're not reading about. And I took that trip. I took the opportunity to speak to a number of domestic opposition figures who were very known among Syrians, as opposed to, the Syrian National Council we've been hearing about outside, with members who most Syrians did not recognize. So I went to speak with domestic opposition figures who had been in Syrian jails, some for up to a decade, and were well known, or relatively well known, within the Syrian populace. What I got from that was also striking. To a person, they rejected any foreign intervention, they rejected the militarization of this conflict, and they rejected sanctions. So, it was eye-opening in that I saw that there is an entirely different Syrian body politic, even in opposition to the Syrian government, that is not represented whatsoever in the Western media and much of the sort of Saudi-owned, I guess, Arab media. So that was interesting. And there was another thing I think that struck me during this trip was I spoke to some NGOs, and off the record they were telling me about sort of in conflict or conflicted areas of Syria where there were casualties, that it was not a simple matter, that there were armed people shooting at soldiers and other officials, policemen, etc. And that this was not a straightforward conflict as was being reported, which led me to, I've done a lot of pieces on Syria now, but I think for me, my most important piece that came out of this trip was one on the Syrian casualty list. And I draw your attention to this because it's kind of the crux of the whole matter. I mean, people are screaming humanitarian crisis, and people are talking about, humanitarian intervention, basically because of this list, this ever-growing list with, numbers that started off in hundreds and then thousands, and now, apparently above 20,000. And I came back from Syria that first trip, and I interviewed the United Nations, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I interviewed the Red Cross, the Red Crescent in Syria. I interviewed some of the casualty counting groups who are in opposition to the Syrian government. And what I sort of gleaned from all this research was that, and this was published back in February of this year, was that there is parity in the numbers of people killed on both sides. So there is no disproportionate Syrian regime response to a sort of peaceful civilian protests around the country. And I pointed out to the fact that even from as early as April 2011, so a few weeks after the first protests were seen in Daraa, you had incidents where, for instance, in Tartus, in Banyas, where 9 police officers were shot in a vehicle, and other incidents where off-duty policemen or soldiers, even a general traveling with his 2 sons and a nephew, were killed in cold blood. And these were acts of provocations to elicit, in my view, a response from the Syrian armed forces to then, create the storyline of the Arab Spring in Syria, brutal regime repressing us, using heavy weapons and not rubber bullets, weapons to kill, so this civilian list or this casualty list story was an important one because it still remains to this day the crux of the argument for why people are, sanctioning Syria, why they're talking about military intervention, why they're talking about creating humanitarian corridors. It's all because of this perception that the Syrian government is slaughtering unarmed, innocent civilians who are just, voicing their right to a freer, more democratic society, which clearly Syria could probably do with, but it's not what's happening in Syria.
Sure.
I posit from the beginning it is actually very even on both sides. The brutalities and the killing have reached parity from very early on.
So as your reporting became increasingly anti-insurgency, you weren't towing the mainstream media line. You wrote that the Huffington Post actually began to censor your blog posts about Syria. Can you just tell us about your experience with that?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say they waited, and I wouldn't say that it became my writing became increasingly anti-insurgent. I simply questioned, and I did investigative work, which is not my thing because I write commentary and analysis. But Syria was so confusing. So one sort of went, read between the lines and went deeper and tried to get original sourcing. And I, as I wrote these stories, it wasn't, I think people viewed me as being pro-regime, which was not at all the case because I was never speaking to anyone in the regime. I was always only speaking to domestic opposition figures and not the ones, bandied around by the mainstream media. But I think the Huffington Post changed, with me at least, when AOL purchased it in early 2011. This was the first time I saw any censorship. Prior to that, really, I could write about anything, and my tone hasn't changed very much about how I report on the Middle East. When the Huffington Post had first engaged me, the world editor at the time, who was the founding world editor, was very excited about a trip I was making to the Middle East, where I was interviewing for the first time senior members of Hezbollah and Hamas, So here was the Huffington Post, very keen to hear alternative viewpoints from the Middle East. And don't forget, both these organizations were on the U.S. list of terrorist organizations. So, it was a bold new world. The blogosphere and the Huffington Post was taking the lead. And not censoring voices and allowing voices like mine an opportunity to be heard. When AOL purchased the Huffington Post, the first time I saw any of my work censored, the first was a piece on Hezbollah's, or allegations that Hezbollah had Scuds, which has been an old Israeli allegation. And I'd actually started researching this in 2009. So when a terrible article in the Times of London came out on it, I used that as an opportunity to sort of showcase my research on whether Hezbollah has Scuds or not. That was censored. There was another piece that was censored later last year, which was on the Iran-Saudi assassination hoax, which I called a hoax. And then the very first piece I wrote on Syria was censored, and it was just a revelatory piece on the Arab League deliberations on Syria, where I produced original material that wasn't in the media. And then they allowed my piece on Stratfor, calling the opposition liars, out, and then never allowed another piece of mine on Syria to be published on the Huffington Post. So it was, well, I think it's important because Syria on the world pages of the Huffington Post was the largest story of the last year. And they repeatedly published articles, timeline out of Beirut and Amman by correspondents and writers from wire services who had not been to Syria, but refused to even publish the first-hand account of one of the Huffington Post's very own bloggers on the Middle East, on the new AOL Huffington Post hybrid. So that was shocking. It was shocking. What can I say? I mean, it's not. You about Amber Lyon's piece. or Amber Lyon being censored at CNN. I remember watching her in the early days of her Bahrain coverage and saying, wow, how are they allowing this, you know? And I have a colleague at the National Review online, the neoconservative publication, who has also recently seen his Syria pieces, which question the mainstream dominant narratives, now being censored. So I think it's happening in all media, and it raises questions about, you know, how this is happening in all media, and, you know, the same old storyline, which I think is accurate about who owns the media and what their interests are.
Well, you know, one of the things that you mentioned was the importance of this narrative in the mainstream media or the NATO-run media. And one of the articles that you wrote was reporting about the U.S. Special Forces Unconventional Weapons Manual. And I was wondering, can you describe to us what is in this unconventional warfare manual and how that relates to Syria, and why having this narrative of, you know, a hit list of, like, you know, how many have died today and the perception controlled by the mainstream media is so important?
Yeah, look, I came across the Unconventional Warfare Manual on an obscure blog somewhere. It wasn't even the manual, it was a link that I just came across, and my mouth dropped, and I ran to my editor at the time and said, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, this is, you know, huge. I think probably for old hands at InfoWars, it's probably not as much of a revelation, but I mean, clearly when I put it online at Al Akhbar English, it was picked up by numerous alternative U.S. and European media, and it was an eye-opener for a number of people, so I'm always happy to talk about this. It's, you know, the U.S. decided after Iraq and Afghanistan, which were conventional wars that put a lot of American money, men, and military hardware to use, that it was too expensive a proposition for them. So they created something that's always been there, a manual for unconventional warfare, and declared that for the foreseeable future, U.S. forces will predominantly engage in irregular warfare operations. So what does this mean? Well, so the United States government has a perceived foe, let's say the Assad regime or the Iranian regime or the Libyan regime, and they look at these countries this way. Unconventional warfare is really to get local populations to fight America's wars on its behalf. So they look at a population as a whole, and they recognize that there's a small sliver that is very pro-government, and there's a small sliver that's very anti-government. But in the middle, you have a largely uncommitted population. Perhaps they're apathetic, perhaps they kind of like their government, perhaps they kind of don't, but they're not moved to do anything about it. As is probably the case with the American population. A small sliver that's very pro-Obama, small sliver that's very anti-Obama, and then an uncommitted middle. And the goal of unconventional warfare is to sway the uncommitted middle by using psychological means to support a rebellion against their government. And this is where, you know, if you look back in some of the revolutions we've seen in Eastern Europe and even before, you see incidents that, you know, now that we have this manual, this blueprint right in front of us, makes you wonder. I mean, there's incidents of snipering. In Syria, for instance, you saw, you know, young children being sniped. Why would the Syrian government want to do this when at the same time they were engaging with leadership in local towns and villages and cities across Syria to try to, you know, calm down? So, you know, there's a pyramid used in the Unconventional Warfare Manual, which, by the way, can be found on my Al Akhbar English article. A link to it in the first paragraph if anyone wants to read the whole thing. But the pyramid actually, you know, discusses doing how do you sway the middle population. You engage in acts of sabotage. You exploit the vulnerabilities of a government, and you do things, for instance, like backing or pushing strikes and boycotts at a local level to give the impression of widespread populist or discontent within the population. You have you then take it to another level where you have sabotage in cities. You have acts of terrorism, to be quite frankly, in cities. You expand operations, and you then create a national liberation front, which will be militarized, and then you create a national governing body that is supposed to be the voice of the opposition. In this case, the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian National Congress, SNC. So, this diagram and the explanation in the Unconventional Warfare Manual, when I saw it, absolutely mirrored what we were seeing happening in Syria. And I think in what we saw happen in Libya. And what I think the U.S. government was attempting last February in Iran, when it kicked off like Twitter activities and whatnot to sort of whip up the populations in Iran. And we're seeing this now in Iran as well. So it's about slowly creating perception of widespread discontent, and then some incidents to whip up popular anger, and then you translate that further into supporting a rebellion. You, at a certain point, the U.S. Unconventional Warfare Manual instructs participants to then solicit at that point you get foreign assistance in the term of equipment, in the form of equipment, cash, I think training, and then then you take it a little bit further. You have increased agitation. You infiltrate the police forces, the army. You try to solicit the defection of major players in the government and in the armed forces and in the police forces and any government affiliated organization. You expand front organizations. You start upping overt and covert activities. At some point, the United States has hit its forces involved, but more the periphery. Like I said, this unconventional warfare is about saving the American military blood and treasure. You get the Arabs to fight your wars for you, and more and more guerrilla actions, more and more urban sabotage. You take it to the capital, and then you have a regime change, basically. We saw this in Libya. But in Libya, it wasn't the U.S. Remember, the U.S. led from behind the NATO operations. And, it's questionable whether Libya happened so quickly. We hardly had a chance to take a breath. But it's questionable now, I think, whether Gaddafi would have been ousted had NATO not been involved. And I think because NATO has not been able to get involved in Syria because of Russian and Chinese veto, you now have the U.S. soliciting the tacitly or directly, we don't know yet, the involvement of jihadists who are flooding the Syrian borders and carrying out military operations and bringing know-how about urban sabotage and bombings and suicide bombings to Syria.
So it's really interesting, especially what you mentioned about the sniping and the bombing. Like that's actually in the manual to try to provoke an uprising, and that's pretty much exactly as we saw by the script that what happened in Syria. And you mentioned the jihadists in Syria, and what I've heard you say before, which is very intriguing, is that Al-Qaeda, we label it Al-Qaeda, but the definition of it is not exactly as the mainstream media had us believe over the last decade, that it was this mega organization that had subterranean bases and it was just everywhere, and it seemed to be everywhere that the US needed to attack. But now, of course, as they did in Afghanistan, when they were trying to kick the Soviets out, they funded and created Al-Qaeda. They're doing this again, but in a different way, because you have people from all over the world now, across the Middle East, even in Sydney, Australia, and in Europe, taking up and holding the Al-Qaeda flag and chanting Osama, Osama, Obama, Obama, we love Osama. So it's become, Al-Qaeda has become more like an idea, and I believe it's really been just an idea or a meme that the media has been propelling. And you actually wrote something about this in 2009. You wrote an article, Al-Qaeda Under My Bed. And I believe you also said that there's a new Stratfor document that's come out that's actually admitted, Al-Qaeda is just a meme and a loose, group of jihadists that are taking on this ideology. So could you comment on what your theory is?
Not an Al-Qaeda expert. The article I wrote in, I think it was January of 2010, was called Looking Under My Bed for Al-Qaeda, because at that time there were, I think, the U.S. was droning in Yemen, and there was an explosion of something, I think, in the south of Jordan, Islamist, Salafist militants. And at the, and the U.S. was taking a very, very suddenly resurgent active role in the region. And perhaps with the peace process not working out and its Iranian regime change plans not working out, and the volume against Israel becoming deafening globally. So, I basically argued that I'm going to be looking under my bed for Al-Qaeda tonight because they're springing up everywhere all of a sudden. And, whether they're really Al-Qaeda or not was questionable, because I recall in a couple of years ago sitting with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Chief of Staff for Secretary of State Colin Powell. And, he said to me, there are 242 Al-Qaeda operatives, and we're running after them like they're the biggest national security threat. And he said, we have possibly 10% of Americans who are a bigger threat to national security than 242 Al-Qaeda operatives, who are running scared in the Middle East. So, there were never a lot, and I think experts state this, and every day or week you're hearing that another Al-Qaeda operative or several Al-Qaeda operatives have been taken out by drone attacks. And so, what's happened to that number? Can there possibly be any remaining? And I did notice that everywhere the U.S. went in the region, when they did start droning activities, Al-Qaeda type groups were springing up in other areas. And I think, by and large, it is the United States that has made the largest investment in Al-Qaeda by far, because everywhere they go, they grow the global brand and invest in the expansion of Al-Qaeda franchises. The whole idea behind why Al-Qaeda even came to be is because of, American troops being on sacred soil in Saudi Arabia. And this was, a sacrilege, and we wouldn't tolerate it anymore. So initially, other than the antagonism that the Al-Qaeda founders had towards the Saudi regime, the Al-Saud family, and many of those monarchies, there was huge antagonism towards the U.S. Military in particular, and Israel, of course. But now you see something different. I agree with you 100%. Al-Qaeda has morphed into an idea, a brand, a convenient scapegoat for just about any operation the U.S. and its allies want to undertake in the Muslim world at large. Today, you have Al-Qaeda more as an idea. You have young men who are frustrated, angry, disenfranchised, who are, wearing the Al-Qaeda flag and Al-Qaeda black to, represent this idea. Now, the problem is, in some of these areas, Al-Qaeda is on the same side as the United States. It's avowed enemy. And increasingly, certainly in places like Syria and in Libya and even against Iran, where you see militant Salafists engaging, where the U.S. used to fuel this militant Salafist resentment, we now see the U.S. engaging militant Salafism. And I think you could, very appropriately call them America's Islamist handmaidens, because certainly in the battles we're seeing in the Middle East, the U.S. is either tacitly or directly allowing the growth or involvement of these type of individuals into conflict. The United States very erroneously thinks that it can control these elements, or that it can allow it to get to the point where there's controlled chaos. Unfortunately for the people of these regions, these militant Salafists are just as much abhorred in the region as they are by, in the, Western media. So it's terrible for the region. This region doesn't need controlled chaos. It needs building bricks to get to the next level. And frankly, it's time that the United States made a really strong exit from this region. I'm talking, rolling back their bases and getting the hell out. Nobody wants American money. Take your, ill-intended, conditional financial assistance to and get out, because no matter what kind of credit Obama and others are taking about bringing freedom and democracy to this region, it is the United States that has backed the most brutal and undemocratic regimes in this region. They continue to do so with the Gulf monarchies. Their two biggest bases are the big military bases in Qatar, the largest in the region, and their largest naval base in the region is in Bahrain. So the U.S. government, I think, has allocated, has now agreed to sell the Gulf Cooperation Council member countries, I think it's $129 billion of weapons. This is since the Arab awakening took off. So it's crazy. It's they're not helping. The U.S. is not helping whatsoever towards helping populations move towards any kind of freedom or democracy. It's absolutely the contrary. The U.S. government has sucked it up where it's needed to with Egypt and with Tunisia, but it sure as hell isn't going to let anyone else get away with it, and is very much behind the counter-revolution swing through this region. And in my view, the counter-revolutions are a distraction from the countries most likely to be hit by public, widespread popular protest. We saw those in what happened. It was Tunisia with Ben Ali, and it was Egypt's Mubarak, and around the same time, Yemen and Bahrain caught on fire, and we were hearing about street demonstrations and a few beatings in Jordan, and these are all U.S. supported governments, and it was essential to move things away from these U.S. proxy states, because otherwise, the U.S. would be out of the region. And so you had Libya very conveniently stirred up, and now Syria. And of course Iran stays on the map. But I remember an article. I remember thinking when all this started in 2011, how is the U.S. going to tolerate this? And David Sanger of the New York Times, who I don't love, he writes silly stories on the Iranian nuclear issue, but he absolutely, I think, hit the nail on the head when he talked about the Obama administration looking at every single one of these uprisings in the Arab world through the prism of how this affects Iran's growing hegemony and growing influence in the region. Even if we would, in the United States, be okay with reforms in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, not while Iran was gaining. And we would not let Iran gain. And so, this is sadly, the story of the Arab Spring. It's become, the American-Saudi counter-revolution. Hopefully, and I tend to think, as others perhaps who are in the world of Middle East geopolitics, that Syria might actually be the final battleground on this, because Syria was so badly done. There was a lot of chutzpah in what the U.S. did in Syria.
Definitely.
Really gargantuan balls to go into a country and from one end to the other, whip up these kind of revolts. And not only that, but completely lie and misrepresent, what's going on there. And what happened in Syria that's interesting is other growing global hegemons. I mean, we're going towards a multilateral world. So those other players stepped up, the BRICS in particular, and most notably the Russians and the Chinese stood up and said, no way, no more. You've shot your wad. This is the last UN Security Council resolution for this kind of warfare was Libya. It's not going to happen in Syria. And we see the Russians increasingly wrapping their arms around Syria. And I think, it's a wise thing to do. It's the other BRIC countries like India and Brazil also agree with this, that Syria is for Syrians to resolve. And it's not for anybody else. It's not for neighboring states. It's not for international players. It's for Syrians to resolve. And it's probably the only way to do it, because right now they're importing foreigners to help win a battle that is unwinnable. And this Syrian battlefield is, I think, going to be the last battle the United States is going to fight in the Middle East. It's lost its conventional wars, and it has, I think, if Syria had happened in 3 months, nobody would have noticed these games. Nobody would have noticed this irregular warfare. But because it's been now 19 months, so much is under scrutiny. I think many people in the region have started to see the level and intensity of games and machinations that have gone into, thwarting the will of a population and creating rebellion. And I don't think it's going to happen easily again. Certainly the Iranians are on watch.
Oh, let's hope for the best in this case. I do get a lot of hope from just listening to you talk about that. And I'm really thankful that you came to talk to us today. I certainly learned a lot. And I guess I'll be speaking to you again soon.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks a lot, Charmaine. And again, your newspaper is called Al-Akhbar, is it? And where people can access your...
I write, they can look for this article in Al-Akhbar English. I've published most of my articles on Syria in Al-Akhbar English, but I also have my blog at MideastShuffle.com, which my other pieces in the New York Times and Salon.com and Huffington Post also appear. And I can always be followed on Twitter at @SNarwani.
Okay. Thanks again, Charmaine.
Thank you.
Bye.
Visit Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com. When you're on the site, you can also tune in 24 hours a day to my daily radio broadcast. There's also a free iPhone app to listen to the syndicated radio show when and where you want.